We are back, and we are joined now by Noah Kulwin, co-host of the Blowback podcast, which I can't say enough good things about, and contributing editor at Jewish Currents. Noah also writes for Defector. Noah, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I felt it was important to have you on because of your foreign policy background and the fact that, you know, I can have a conversation with you that's pretty broad, but also hits on all of the very real and disturbing dynamics of what have unfolded over the past 7 days, including the latest update is that Israel is telling over 1 million Gazans to evacuate and move south in 24 hours, which is obviously impossible. The United Nations has said so. I mean, some people are leaving, understandably, but of course, understandably, but part of what the issue is that there has been an electricity and fuel blockade for 6 days at this point? How is this even being communicated to people in Gaza? Because, I saw apparently they're doing so by flyers, but there's no internet. That people can't even communicate with others in Gaza right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's this is not about actually having the idea, this whole thing of warning the citizens, telling them to evacuate and so forth. That's it's CYA. It's covering your ass. It's about basically saying, listen, we gave them excuses, we gave them reasons, etc. So you can't call this what it is, which is a genocide. It's a genocide. And you could argue that this is just simply, the next step, the logical procession from the practice of, it's okay to bomb civilian infrastructure in Gaza, so long as we drop a small bomb first on top of the building, so that we call it a door knock, so that we tell them to leave, because that's how they used to do it. And that's not a policy that they're even doing anymore now with round-the-clock bombing. So, I mean, this is there's no actual reasonable purpose for it. It's entirely about having the ex post facto justification, so that when they're pulling corpses out of the rubble, they'll be able to say something to the effect of, well, they didn't have to be there. Even though, I think anybody by now who's been watching this unfold, if they know anything, it's that Gazans have absolutely nowhere to go.
Yeah, and then I think that's a good way to kind of just give a broad picture of how little power and how few resources Palestinians and Gazans have broadly. I've been trying to make this point on the show, but there have not been elections in Gaza since 2006, 2007. 70% youth unemployment, 50% unemployment more broadly. 90% of people in Gaza don't have access to clean water. So we're talking about one of the most impoverished populations in the world. And that underscores their inability to flee. But it also underscores the level of desperation that we're talking about here and the complete asymmetry when we're talking about, which side are you on? Israel versus Palestine. Palestine versus Israel. When we understand that the relationship between Israel and Palestinians is one of occupier and the occupied. And if you could just talk a bit about how that power dynamic gets so routinely flattened in the Western press.
Sure. So I think that in particular, talking about Hamas and the fact that there haven't been, elections in something like 17 years in Gaza, Gaza it's in the West Bank, a military occupation. So in the if you look at a map of Israel and you see what is labeled Palestine or Palestinian territory in a map, the Gaza Strip is what's on the left to the west on the Mediterranean Sea. And the West Bank is it's contiguous with the Jordan River, and it looks like it's in the middle of Israel. And in the West Bank, a military occupation, it looks kind of like it sounds. There are checkpoints everywhere within the territory that control the flow of movement of Palestinians. Not to mention, obviously, the checkpoints between Israel proper territory and then where Palestinians live. And additionally, there is also a system of apartheid in that literally there are roads that Palestinians are not allowed to drive on, but that Jewish settlers who live on what is internationally recognized as stolen land, pretty unequivocally, they have free access. So that's where you see a kind of conventional system of apartheid. In Gaza in 2005, under then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was a pretty right-wing figure, he made the decision quite cleverly. In retrospect, he felt he died. He became sick and died not long after. but he made the decision to, we're going to shut down the very small number of settlements that do exist in Gaza, and we're going to initiate an enhanced version of what had already been in place and been developing over time, which was a blockade, a complete, and like, if something enters Gaza officially, legally, whether it's a candy bar or it's hospital supplies, or it's an Xbox, it is, it's a process that is overseen by Israel. They are the ones who have control over what goes in and out. So this also extends, by the way, to, when we look at rubble in Gaza, and we see people using their hands and using shovels and, like manual tools to pick up, in complete apartment blocks that have fallen, to find, children in small places between the rubble, and to pull them out. That's because Israel does not allow in the heavy machinery or the construction material that's required for, the actually either both doing that job and for making the kinds of, buildings that could even be somewhat more safe. As opposed to just, high rises that Israel blows up. Or to use the phrase of Netanyahu himself in a meeting a few years ago that was later made public as a result of the corruption cases against him, Israel controls how high the flames go. They control how much resistance Gazans can offer. And so, which brings us just to this moment of, you describe what's an unequal power relationship, or the relationship between occupier and occupied. It's not just it's not just like this kind of tug of war relationship between two sides, one with less power and one with more. One of the sides controls the situation, and they control this situation in the way that they do with the inordinate body counts that they possess, both because of hyper-nationalist ideology, but also because this is the way historically that Israel has sought to maintain the control that it has over the land that it does, while giving its citizens the preferential rights that they enjoy.
And well, that brings me, I guess, to the the security failure that we're talking about here. The fact that there were not adequate numbers of IDF forces on the southern border, and they were mostly going along with the settlers and aiding them in their kind of pogroms, and that's where they were deployed. And there's a lot of questions about what Netanyahu knew and what he did not know, and it's still fog of war. We're figuring all of this out. But the an Egyptian intelligence official, and again, take this with a boulder of salt because they have their own incentives as well, but they're claiming that he knew about that he was informed that this was likely.
So it's worth emphasizing that the Israeli government initially denied this very strongly,
right?
And then the Israeli press began reporting it as well, and there were corroborated reports. And so then you think like, okay, so wow, that sounds pretty good, right? We got multiple competing reports that corroborate and show this. There are any number of reasons why it may be that it's not like fully or totally accurate or representative. There are also a lot of reasons, it is very persuasive as evidence that the Israelis were caught off guard, that they wanted something to happen as a pretext to initiate the kind of cyclical violence that they often do to consolidate their political bases. And, this is, you're talking about a country that has had something like half a dozen elections in the last 5-6 years. You're talking about a country that is really only able to develop something that resembles political consensus when it is engaged in wartime or quasi-wartime measures. I think the sort of what we have seen since with these denials and the other reports about the Egyptian warning is that there are knives out for Benjamin Netanyahu. He is the most unpopular man in Israel right now. I think that a lot of people kind of rightfully and sort of logically, especially Western observers, thought, oh, wow, well, Bibi's, this is going to fortify his position, right? He's a right winger. There's a terrorist attack. It's going to bolster his position. But the problem is that the Israeli public had been led to believe that not only was Bibi Mr. Security, but that the strategy that he had been pursuing in the last year, and that the policies of supporting the settlers in the West Bank and so on, that they wouldn't undermine the security calculus. That was the specific offer that he made, in a sense. And that was proven wrong. So I think that was Bibi made the fall guy for a broader failure because I don't just think it was one political leader who probably, this is, by the way, something familiar in American history. I think we can learn from, which is that oftentimes, it is like somebody bears responsibility, and they are also a fall guy for, a whole number of other parties that may have been involved, or in this case, to help direct from what is a more strategic culpability that Israel is in. Because even if Netanyahu had, is responsible for the depths of this tragedy, and that the massacres in the South committed by, Hamas fighters who had crossed from Gaza into Israel proper, if those massacres were committed, it's like Israel has this gigantic military. It's incredibly well funded. It's the raison d'etre that it tells its citizens for is to provide them security. When what incidents like this show is that actually the Israeli military is primarily deployed to maintain rest of Palestinian populations. And so I do really believe that it's a kind of like, no matter which way you slice it, like whether it was invited in or not, what the success of the attack shows, the damage it dealt to Israel, both in the civilian lives taken and in the, hostages, civilian and military hostages taken, not to mention equipment stolen and all this other stuff. It's like, whether or not there was some measure of deliberance or deliberate ignorance beforehand, it's a little bit distracting when we don't have more information, simply because what is much more significant and what has a much more substantial influence on the events on the ground now is that the attack was as successful as it was. And that sort of really points to, well, even if they had this deliberate ignorance, the strategic position that they'd put themselves in of just trying to say, well, we're going to keep pummeling Gaza and assume that even though we choke them off, they won't ever resist or they won't ever fight back in a way that we couldn't anticipate. That's been blown totally out of the water. And what that means for Hamas and for the people of Gaza remains a live question now, because Israel's response to that, revelation that the Israeli geopolitical security calculus had this flaw has been to initiate, what we should unequivocally call a genocide, a genocidal campaign to exterminate and ethnically cleanse the Palestinian population in this area. They are considered to Israel a surplus population for whom there is no purpose. And the fairly sick and disgusting prevaricating around setting up some kind of corridor through which they could shunt people out into the Sinai desert, where, Palestinians would be exposed to all sorts of other kinds of violence and depredations. A population of urban dwellers that has been in that territory for 70, 80 years at a minimum. To say nothing obvious, it's just Nakba too, with the added, with the greater horror that the machinery of war is far more deadly, and
white phosphorus. I said this in headlines.
Not only white phosphorus, but also, this is the most important part, with the outright and explicit consent of not just the American government, but the entire Western world. Mm-hmm. I don't have the words to describe the implications of that, other than to, say that it's giving a permission slip for the worst kinds of acts that man can pursue against man.
Yeah, and it also, I think it underscores the exact dynamic that that both of us, I think, are trying to communicate to our respective audiences, which is that condemning a Hamas attack is the easiest thing that one could possibly do. But we are, as Americans, our tax dollars, our government is unequivocally supporting a genocidal attempt by the Israeli government, and that is the active, live question that we are dealing with. And that is there's potential, right? Just to say, like, there's potential in theory to stop the atrocities, as opposed to constantly looking backwards as justification for the future atrocities. And that's what makes the conversation so goddamn infuriating for me, because looking backwards means that you don't have to look at the Palestinian babies under rubble.
No, and you also don't have to consider, look, I think the other part of this is that there have been photographs of, let's say, like, North Korean armaments that have probably made their way via Iran at some point in the past, we don't know when, to Hamas, and that stuff gets headlines. I've seen arm control academics share that stuff. But the more prosaic reality is, where does Hamas get its weaponry? Where do they get the tools that they use to attack Israel? They get it from Israel. They steal it. They buy it illegally. They acquire it through subterfuge. They use all sorts of methods. And then, oh, well, if Israel has it, well, where did Israel get it if they didn't produce it themselves? They got it from the West. And so even if, I have to stress this, like, even if you, are the most right-wing, most like zealously feeling it in your bones, tribal association with Israel right now, I think that, there is even still, it is worth considering and taking seriously the idea that every time you militarize and try to develop a military solution to the Palestinian problem and Palestinian statelessness, all you are doing, the only thing truly, is fueling is I guess reproducing the conditions for another cycle of violence and another genocide with weapons that you are introducing into the conflict zone and so forth, and obviously inflaming the desire for people to acquire weapons and military means through the outside world in other ways. There is what Americans have as a unique political subjectivity. We are citizens. We are in the seat of empire and so forth. And that's why our politicians make it so easy for us and there are no consequences. There's literally nothing that will come back to you in any negative way for condemning atrocities committed by Hamas. But the moment that you start to jeopardize, some of the fundamental strategic assumptions of the American state and of our media about what protects us and what keeps us safe and how that includes a strong Israel, it's at that moment that I think you really begin to, as you say, like it reveals where actually our power as American political subjects and citizens lies. It shows that the more you talk about Palestine, the more you talk about Israeli atrocities, every word you utter publicly on that front does more to advance some kind of peace, simply because that's what our American checks are going toward. They're going toward paying for the Israeli government to, through ways that we cannot even fathom, expand the sphere of violence that consumes this place.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a bit more about the domestic discussion here in the United States, because you talked a bit about how so far there has been polling on this front. Bibi Netanyahu is being soundly blamed for the atrocities and domestically in Israel, and it's not a good situation from him from a polling perspective. But that domestic conversation in Israel runs completely counter to a lot of what we're seeing from the Western press and the complete dehumanization of Palestinians, just basically by in absence of even really talking about them or giving them some sort of.
I want to intervene just a little bit, just because I think that there is it's worth pointing out, right? Like 4 in 5 Israelis think Netanyahu sucks. Like Haaretz, like we are seeing a lot of the Haaretz editorial board, like article gets shared very widely,
right,
etc. That should not, for a moment, actively, really change people's perception that what is happening in Israel as a whole among the body politic at this moment is something other than, a social conditioning for the commission of genocide. Not that you were saying otherwise, but just because I've seen this presented, I think, as, a kind of like, isn't it crazy how Israelis are freer to speak criticism of their government than we are? And it's like that's because they're there. But I think it's, it's in our domestic political situation is just so much more constricted, or feels that way, because our culpability is, in many ways, it comes with the freedom of complete choice. We could choose to stop writing checks to fund the Iron Dome and to force Israel to the table. We could do what James Baker did in the early 1990s, George H.W. Bush's cabinet member, in pressuring the Israelis to go to Madrid and make the concessions that would ultimately lead to Oslo. A terrible process, but at least something that was an alternative to, Israeli bombs. And, that to me is just the kind of like that sort of just about sums it up as the kind of.
Certainly, and you mentioned Bush Senior, but like a lot of what I'm seeing in the press, there are parallels to the loyalty tests after 9/11.
I actually pulled up an article from Yediot Achronot's English language website, and the headline is "Israel's war is the war of the free world." Opinion: progressive circles, quote unquote, embedded in academia, media provide justification to those who attack Israel and the West. While neither is immune to criticism, their transgressions pale in comparison to the threat posed by the jihadi movement and its offshoots to the very existence of the free world. You know, like, let's you know, like, that's 9/11. That is post 9/11 claptrap. And you know, that we are seeing reproduced. This is an Israeli, you know, translated in English, saying this kind of thing, but you know, it's what Lindsey Graham was saying on Twitter and on TV. It's what many Democratic politicians are saying right now. It's a resurrection of the rhetoric from after 2001, when, to justify the vast atrocities that we would carry out in, you know, not just those few months after 9/11, but in the years to come, we had to create a scale of conflict that could suit the, you know, our imagination, as opposed to, you know, a more prosaic reality, which is that we literally funded and trained the guys who did 9/11 to us.
I mean, the Israeli government funded Hamas.
Exactly. It's so there becomes this, like, you have to, like, you know, like you could argue that the capacity for developed nations to deal this kind of technological destruction is, you know, like that it has a pattern, that it has a kind of, you know, that there is a shock and an indignation that comes when, you know, there is a blow that is dealt, and there is the immediate, like, you know, like a desire to say, well, this was an exception. This tragedy, whether it was, you know, Israelis massacred in the south in the desert at kibbutzim and at a music festival, it exists as an exception outside of the patterns of conflict that preceded it and afterward. And that's an exception and a privilege that can get claimed by, you know, the Western press and by the Israeli press, because they have the resources for it, and they have the audience for it, and they have, you know, it's yeah, I mean, it's rather like, you know, I think that if anything is one of the you know, in addition to just like trying to lobby the American government in whatever limited and fairly pathetic ways that American citizens have at their disposal on these issues, is also to just, you know, remind people that, like, yeah, Hamas soldiers, and it's not just because badly, like, oh, life is bad in Gaza. There is like, the tragedies of this past week, alongside the very, you know, like, you know, limited slivers of hope that many Palestinians took from seeing the separation barrier torn down and so on. You know, it's directly related to the pogroms in Hawara in the West Bank earlier this year, and just a few years ago, when the Palestinians launched in Gaza a great march of return, a peaceful march protest that was just, you know, like, I mean, it was a mass, it was a slaughter. Israeli soldiers murdered hundreds, permanently wounded thousands. And, you know, I think that is the kind of thing that you don't invoke as a way of saying, well, this cancels out, you know, the massacres in Israel. No, it's a way of explaining, how did those massacres in Israel happen? Because these things don't, you know, like these acts of violence do not arise out of nowhere. And for what it's worth, I think Americans should, you know, consider taking a fucking look in the mirror themselves and thinking about, like, well, gee, why is it that people commit mass fucking shootings all the time in this country? You know, and have the means to do it and so forth. Like, I think it would be wise for us to consider, like, when we do have these explosions of violence that take place and, you know, literally do not make sense or are unable to be processed by, you know, people who do live, like myself, fairly comfortable and you know, untraumatic lives. You know, to ask, like, how it is that these crimes register with them and the others do not.
Well, I mean, I saw, and I'm gonna honestly forget who made this. Oh, it was Murtaza Hussein. Made this point on Twitter that Americans have more of a visceral understanding of what it means to be shot to death because of our domestic experience, but that it's so far away from our imagination, having relentless bombing on top of your homeland in such a highly concentrated area. And I know we don't have you for too much longer, so I could expect we could talk even more about that. We could go forever, but I wanted to kind of really ask you this final question and talk about this. The dynamic of Israelis not needing to be perfect victims for the United States to and for Western media to find sympathy for them, but for Palestinians or Palestinian representatives or supporters of Palestinians to come on television and they have to first denounce Hamas, denounce Hamas, denounce Hamas. you have to be a perfect victim to get any sympathy. Whereas if you're an expert that's in promoting what Israel is doing right now, there's never a prerequisite to say, do you condemn the mass murder of civilians by your government, by your representatives, which is much more formal than anything that Palestinians are allowed to engage in. Talk a bit about that, Noah.
Yeah, I think that there's I talked about this on Hassan Piker's stream yesterday or the day before, but there was a game after 9/11, and others have talked about it, like the "Do You Condemn" game. Like, and it's a test that's applied to anybody who participates in Western political debate, and you talk about, in particular, Islamic terrorism. It was a huge fad after 2001. I mean, anytime anybody with a lick of sense would get up and say something like, well, like, it's kind of interesting that these, Islamic extremists are doing beheadings in the Philippines when, we kind of helped set those guys up in Afghanistan a few years ago. Like, you would get, like, that's apologism for terrorism. And I think that is, it's like, okay, that's the sort of like default that you get as a participant in discourse in Western life. For Palestinians, it's not just like a requirement to, it's not like it's merely like something that they have to say to participate in public life, although that is true. It's also like a message that is like, targeted directly at, like not just Palestinians, but I mean broadly for anybody who is the victim of violent, dehumanizing violence that can be, that has its roots in, Western policy, which this, sort of like absolutely does. And I think that there is a kind of, the reason that Palestinians are made to be these perfect victims, that you have to have, representatives of the PLO, an organization that's not Hamas and is in fact a rival to Hamas, have to get up on BBC Newsnight and basically, so like, I condemn, I do this, I do that, I do that, before they can say, oh yeah, and like my sister's whole family was killed. Mm-hmm. Like before they can even get to meaningfully, discussing that. Yeah, they're bombarded with the sentiment that their lives are, and their families like they, it's a full spectrum experience that Palestinians have to, and as I said earlier, not just Palestinians, have to encounter, that they have to watch and that they have to see on the TV, and they have to wait to see that their experience is processed and understood by the outside world in the only moments when the outside world seems to give a shit, which is when Israel has experienced a wound bad enough to, make its appeal to the world. Yeah, I mean, I think, when I was younger, I thought that there was a kind of special incumbency that I possessed as a Jewish person to, stick up for Palestinians in that way. But the longer and the more that I feel like the kind of, Zionism that I was raised with, and, in the Jewish world, is kind of, it's becoming embedded in the firmament, and it affects the default assumptions about whose lives are worth stuff and whose aren't, that many people who did not have my background, now feel. Like, I think it's become something, it has become even more powerful over time, of a kind of like legacy and, like a film, like a filmy substance over the way that Americans in broadly experience the world. And I think, sort of lesson one of, trying to figure out like, well, how do we undo this, process by which we make Palestinians have to fucking apologize for their own existence? It kind of begins with, directly confronting these, frankly, deeply racist assumptions that, guide our decisions about whose lives are worth shit and whose aren't.
Noah Kulwin, I really appreciate your passion and like your clarity in this moment. Contributing editor at Jewish Currents. Everybody who hasn't listened to Blowback yet, please do. We'll put a link to the podcast in the description. Thanks so much for your time today, Noah. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.